I spent the night in an abandoned house. Here are the rules I learned. I arrived as a cold rain slicked the lane, coat collar turned up against a wind that smelled of wet wood and something older, damp paper, iron, the slow rot of things left to remember themselves. The gate had been hanging off one hinge for years. The porch sagged like a tired jaw. Inside, the air held the kind of silence that presses back when you move through it. It's not emptiness so much as a fullness of absence. The foyer still wore its family: coats on pegs, a brass umbrella stand, a faded photograph in an ovaled frame, 3 people and a black dog, staring out as if they'd been interrupted mid-story. On the second step up to the front hall, there was a soft depression in the runner where feet had carved the pile down to thread. The 7th step, though, the 7th step had a hollow beneath it. You could feel it through the wood if you put a palm there, a hollow with the thickness of a coin, and something inside that responded to pressure like a living thing. I felt it the way you might feel the pulse of a stranger under the skin, unbidden, too close. I wasn't there because I like trespassing in old houses. I won't tell you exactly how I got inside. Either the executor misplaced a key, or a neighbor with more curiosity than sense left the back gate unsecured. What matters is what I found: a shabby leather tape recorder tucked beneath the cushions of an armchair in the parlor, a stack of brittle papers bound with twine, and a house that remembered names. They call it the Montgomery place because that's who owned it for 100 years. The family built a machine out of deeds and promises and the hollow places between floors. They fed it with bargains. The earliest entry in the papers I found dates to 1891, a yellowed note that mentions a threshold in the woods, an oak that produced a single fruit once a year, an offer made in a moment of desperation. The man who made the first bargain wanted the house to keep his name safe, his line prosperous. He thought he could bargain with the house the way men bargain with each other, ledger for ledger, check for check. That was the first mistake. I listened to the recorder in fits and starts through the night. The voice on the spool, Daniel Montgomery's, I'm calling him, because that's the signature on half the documents, spoke like a man peeling skin from a wound, practical, ashamed, precise. He told stories with the economy of someone trying to make a tally out of memory, to set down causes and consequences so they could be counted. He told enough to teach rules. He left those rules as a warning, and they are the only reason I am writing this. Rule 1. Never go into the cellar alone. Daniel told me about Margaret in the dry way of someone rehearsing what he could not change.
Margaret was the nanny in the house for decades. Steady hands, small talk in the kitchen, a way of keeping the children from falling into the rooms that like to eat shadows. One winter night, the furnace coughed and a smell of oil rose. Margaret went down to check the flues and never returned. There was no violence written on paper, only the thin record of a line cut from the ledger, a name blacked out, a shoe left in the doorway. The house's appetite did not always appear as hunger. Sometimes it was the way the cellar answered when footsteps fell wrong, a small slip of recognition, a shape remembering that it had once swallowed light. Daniel's voice halts on the recording when he describes the sound Margaret made the last time anyone heard her. He does not speak the sound itself, only that it was wrong, not human, and carried from below as one might carry a secret. That night I almost broke Rule 1. I found the cellar door in the kitchen, a trap of oak set flush with the floorboards. The iron ring felt cold against my fingers. For a moment, the investigator in me argued that evidence waits for those bold enough to retrieve it, that proof would prove the whole story and fix it into facts. I dropped my hand. I stood with my palm pressed to the wood and listened. There was the soft, steady drip of old water, the sigh of a settling house, and beneath them, a faint pattern like someone clearing their throat across a distance too wide for human lungs. The rule is simple because the consequence is simple. You go down alone and something remembers you as a name to be written. You do not have to be romantic about it. The house does not care about your courage. Rule 2. Do not take the fruit. The family lore centered on a tree at the edge of the property, an old oak whose roots denatured the earth in a small ring of bright dirt. It bore a single fruit each year, a pale thing kept hidden in a jar of bran in the pantry when it was ripe. The first bargain used it for a miracle. A child who should have died lived. A disease that had eaten skin left a scar and quit. The fruit's power, Daniel said plainly, came with paperwork. Each use required a name, a drawing of a signature, a line on a ledger. The fruit heals once. The second time it heals, it does so by asking for something it can keep without ceremony. The second time, the fruit becomes hungry. Chloe's story is quiet and terrible. She was a child, small, exuberant, and when the fruit was used for her, someone later realized that its saving had not come without subtraction. Chloe's laughter dimmed, her sleep loosened. A week after she woke, she walked out into the cold and never came back. They say she was buried under the roots of the oak, that her hair fed the soil where the fruit grew, that the tree will produce its loaned mercy only after it grows on seed taken from those it saved. I do not tell that to titillate. I tell it because it is the house's rule. Miracles cost names.
The ledger always balances. I found a dried, shriveled remnant of that fruit sitting on a saucer on the dining table. It looked like a thing someone had swallowed and spat out, its skin powdered under my fingertips. I sat there, the house breathing around me, and felt the ache of wanting the fruit the way a person wants warmth when their hands are numb. It was a temptation as old as winter. For a moment, I imagined it could give me something I had misplaced, an answer, a memory, the courage to tell this whole story without choking. I taped my tongue to the roof of my mouth and told myself that a relic is not a remedy. I put the fruit back, dusted off the saucer, and left it where it was. There are sacrifices, I learned, that you can refuse. If you want the documents I found, the recordings and the list of names, check the pinned link. I'm not hiding them. I'm only asking you to take them with the context they deserve. Rule 3. Don't stand on the hollow step. This is the house's most literal piece of machinery, a hollow in the 7th stair that holds a small carved thing like a heart. Daniel describes it obliquely, not alive in the normal sense, but listening. He writes about the sound it makes when someone stands with weight over it, a low beat, patient and current, like a ledger being rung up on a teller's counter. People said it belonged to the original bargain. They said it was the house's counting machine, a way to make sure the debts were kept. When Daniel first found the thing, he tried to remove it. He pried at the stair for all the arrogance of a man who thinks he can unhook fate with a chisel. The heart would not come. He put his ear to the wood and heard. He never says the word heartbeat, but the recorder carries the pause where he would have said it if he were younger. Later, he learned the cost. Every time the heart was pressed, that household bound itself tighter. The heart is not interested in your intention. It notes possession. It registers names and weights and keeps pressing until the balance is met. I know now why people avoided that step even when the house was newly occupied. That night, moving from room to room, I felt a pull toward the stair as if it were the compass trying to align me to something older. My booted foot hovered above the runner on the 6th step. The thin air of the hall seemed to shift. The lamps flickered in sympathy. I told myself 100 rational things. The house is old, wood warps, you're letting a story tell you how to feel. And then I put my weight on the tread next to the hollow. The wood answered with the thinnest sound, a click, then a pulse like a bell under the floor. My knees wanted to betray me. I stepped back. I did not stand there to make sure the heart did not notice me. The house keeps notes, and whatever it writes, it keeps forever. Rule 4. Never let the house see your name written by you. This one is more abstract, but no less deadly. The ledger Daniel found, the real physical ledger, was a thing of heavy paper and careful ink. Names entered it in precise hand. Settlements were noted with numbers, dates, and the small signature mark the family used for its births and deaths. Daniel read it and felt the awful arithmetic, the way miracles were logged, and how each column had its clearance. A name in the ledger is not just a notation, it is an agreement, a contract that tells the house where to aim its appetite. People began to think they could cheat their way around the ledger by shortening names, by swapping identities, by hiding children in plain sight. That only taught the house to be more precise. The house, Daniel said on the tape, is patient. It will take what it names, and if names cannot be taken from the living, it will take them from the line. He told a story about an aunt who wrote the same name twice by mistake and found it crossed through the next week. He did not say who crossed it out. That blank space in his words is its own ledger entry. I handled an envelope that night, yellowed at the corners, and inside there was a check in the name of a Montgomery descendant, small sums for repairs that were never made. There was a note in an unfamiliar hand with a name and a date. I set it down and put my hand on top as if to smother the ink. Name it aloud in a house that remembers, and you risk offering it to the ledger. The rule becomes survival. Keep your name private. If you must speak it, Speak it into a recorder, and never let the recorder stay in the room. Rule 5. Respect the guardians you cannot explain. Bishop was the family dog, painted into portraits and carved in the banister, photographed in the frames on mantelpieces, with a stance like he was never going to leave. Daniel's papers had whole pages where he chalked down the dog's appearances, at births, at funerals, at times when the house seemed to tilt and the family needed a presence that was not exactly human. Bishop was called a protector in the way people call a lighthouse a savior, a thing that sits and warns. The dog, Daniel said, had a way of appearing when a child needed to be sheltered, of lying with a warmth that kept the house from learning certain names too soon. He saved a child once by barking at a false door. He bit a man who would have done a worse thing and left a scar like a tally on his hand. Bishop's last portrait shows him with cataract-clouded eyes and a muzzle streaked with white. Daniel writes that no one buried Bishop in the family plot. They buried him by the oak where the roots would remember him. There was a photograph of Bishop in the foyer, hung crooked like someone had refolded grief and tucked it back in the frame. When I passed, I put my palm to the glass, and for a heartbeat I swore I felt heat. Maybe it was the lamp, maybe it was my imagination.
But the house arranged things as if there had been a guardian once, and the memory of that guardian protects, in small ways, against the house's appetite. Do not mock the guardians of a place. Treat the objects that remember them with a kind of reverence. It's not religious, it is pragmatic. Rule 6. Refuse to bargain. This is the moral of everything Daniel left behind. The note folded under his ledger, the passage where his voice cracks and then becomes matter-of-fact again. The first bargains were made in panic and love, grandfathers wanting to keep their sons, men who thought they could lease away a calamity and remain untouched. The house, however, does not make loans, it makes accounts. Every kindness it grants is an entry, and every entry expects a correction. Daniel's last clear sentence on the tape is simple. We thought we could buy safety. We only bought time. He used the word we as if heavy with a family that knew it had been complicit. I thought about bargains as I sat in the parlor with the recorder between my knees. The house was old enough to teach moral math. If you accept a miracle, you will pay in something you did not calculate. If you refuse, the ledger has no claim. Refusal is not heroism, it is subtraction. It starves the house of the very currency it knows how to spend. You will be lonely when you say no. You will watch people you love choose comfort. That is the price of not being written into the ledger. The night moved like a slow film. I traced circles on the arm of the chair and listened to Daniel breathe from a spool decades gone. He confessed to things he could not undo. He confessed to trying to end the line, which in his telling was both an attempt at mercy and a last-ditch cutting of the house's supply. He begged the future not to repeat his math. He left rules because he believed that rules could be handed forward where confessions could not. I was at the edge of the long hall when I made the mistake that almost undid me. The parlor had a portrait of the first Montgomery, a man in a high collar and a stare that never seemed to settle. In the portrait's corner, so small I could have missed it, someone had written a single name in pencil. It could have been an heirloom note. It could have been a child's scribble. The pencil dust smeared on my thumb. For a heartbeat, I wanted to rub the name out, to be the one who erased history. To remove a name is a kind of mercy, I thought, a corrector pen against the ledger's entries. I lifted my finger. Something in the house answered. It was not loud, a scraping at the far end of the hall like a chair dragged, a soft, deliberate tread on attic boards. Perhaps a branch had fallen, perhaps a raccoon had taken to the roof. Daniel's voice intruded on the recording, a memory echoing in my ears. We thought names could be overwritten. The house keeps receipts. I froze.
The rules are not only about avoiding certain rooms. They are about not giving the house the performance it needs. A house that thinks you are bold will test you. A house that cracks you open will write your name in ink. I kept my finger on the portrait's frame and did not erase a single letter. The scraping stopped, as if it had heard my restraint and decided to wait. I moved on. There are smaller rules, too, the kinds of habits that seem silly until their absence costs you something. Keep light where you sleep. Do not take a chair with the upholstery that smells like someone. Avoid speaking about the day you left the house. Voices echo and the house overhears. These are not universal laws. They are survival patterns I learned from watching a man on a tape untangle the consequences of his family's decisions. I found a child's doll in a drawer upstairs. Cloth face, one glass eye missing, tucked beneath linens with a smell that was almost clean, as if someone had tried to hide it from time. The doll had a stitched mouth and a name tag reading Chloe in a child's crooked hand. I sat on the landing with that doll in my lap and listened to Daniel describe what they did for Chloe and what they could not do afterward. He did not use the word sacrifice in the rhetorical way we do now, the way language makes brutality into a neat box. He said instead that there was a geometry to their answers, a way the house accepted and then refused. He wrote in his ledger like a man trying to unmake the arithmetic of a family. Midnight thinned into something else. My phone had long since died, no signal on the estate, and my watch ticked with wrongness, as if the house rewired time. I moved through rooms that seemed to have kept the posture of life, a cup left half full on a side table, a chair turned away from the fireplace, the faint smear on the wallpaper where a child's palm had rested. Each artifact was evidence and enticement. I was not immune. There is a natural human impulse to believe that if you document grief, it will not return. Daniel's recorder was protesting that assumption. I found the ledger in an upstairs study, wedged behind volumes of local histories. It was heavier than I expected, bound in cracked leather, and smelled of iron and old ink. I opened it with gloves, more superstition than science, and read entries that were meticulous and banal. Dates, sums, notes about assistance rendered and compensation pending. Names echoed down the columns like a chant. Births, deaths, payments, repairs. A man could attempt to argue that what was in that book was only economics. A man could also attempt to argue that a tree is no more than wood. The ledger, to Daniel and to me that night, read like a list of promises kept in an economy that had no currency but what it took. There were marks in the margins, little vertical strokes next to certain entries, the same mark made across decades, as if a single hand had kept tally across generations.
The marks made a pattern. Daniel's paper beside the ledger translated his suspicion into a rule. If a mark appears near your name, do not take the time to bargain. Run. If you cannot run, leave the name for someone else to claim. It is not elegant. It is a calculation of risk. As I closed the ledger and set it on the desk, the room cooled. The lamp guttered. Upstairs, a window that had long been nailed shut sighed. The house is full of small exhalations like that, movements that might be the building settling, might be animals, might be ghosts. To someone who has lived in a place for a long time, the differences between those things begin to show as texture. To a stranger like me, they read as warnings. I had planned, in some naive hour earlier that day, to stay until dawn, to prove nothing and to record everything. I told myself I would sleep in the study by the ledger, tape running, and in the morning I would leave a note for the historian who might come after me. The night rearranged those intentions. Around 2 in the morning, when the rain had stopped and the moon made a pallid wash across the parlors, I heard the cellar door scrape. It was a simple sound, but it carried the weight of all my decisions. My hands went cold. The rules I had learned unspooled in my head. Don't go into the cellar alone. Don't let the house see your name. Don't take the fruit. Don't step on the hollow step. Respect the guardians. Refuse the bargain. They read like instructions and like confessions. They were all I had between me and whatever the house wanted me to become. I moved toward the kitchen because to stay where I was felt like bait. My footsteps were measured. On the table by the stove, I found a folded envelope with a check peeking from inside. An old bank, a small sum, the payee name scrawled in a hand that could have belonged to an administrator or an accomplice. The check was not proof. It was a promise. I slipped it into my pocket because I could not bear to leave it in a house that counted promises. The recorder sat down the hall, blank light blinking, and I thought of Daniel's last line about refusing bargains until the voice on the tape croaked into uselessness. The cellar door opened wider. The sound was patient now, deliberate. It could have been wind. It could have been a branch falling. If I had been a braver man, I might have said a last brave thing and gone down to see what the house was inventorying. I did not. I learned that night, with all the small humiliations of survival, that courage is not a virtue recommended by old houses. I stood at the mouth of the kitchen and felt the house listening. The ledger is always listening too, not with ears, but with mechanisms. The hollow step, the jarred fruit, the dog's photograph, the paper and pen. Daniel's confession ends with a plea. Do not continue us. He speaks not as a prophet, but as a man who saw accounting through to its bitter end,
and wanted the ledger closed with new names.
The scraping stopped. The house took a breath. I could have left then, before the first light, before the dusk promised to be dawn. Instead, I stayed, for reasons neither brave nor principled. Maybe curiosity, maybe the petty hope of witnessing something real. I went to the stair and placed my hand above the hollow. The heart inside responded with the smallest, almost amused click. A letter slid from the banister. A thin strip of paper, like the ticker of a cash register, fell into my palm. On it was a single word, written in pencil: balance. That was where the night's first part ends for me. I folded the strip, wedged it into my glove, and listened as somewhere in the house something unlatched by degrees. The house was not satisfied, and neither was I. I had rules to keep me whole for the moment, but rules do not always add up to safety. They are instead a set of behaviors that make you harder to notice, until perhaps you are not. Balance. That scrap of pencil in my glove felt like a verdict in my pocket. I sat for a long time after that, listening as the house rearranged its attention. The lamp hissed, the hour pinched, and the recorder in the parlor spat out the last of Daniel's breathy admissions into the dark. He had counted, he had miscounted, he had tried to stop the arithmetic. He taught rules because the ledger would not stop on its own. Rule 7. Do not sleep where the house can record your shape. Daniel's pages were patient about the small betrayals that begin a life's undoing. He wrote about sleeping places not as comfort zones but as pages the house reads into its book. Margaret's last nights, he said, had been spent on a mattress that had always been in the nursery. Chloe had once been laid in the room next to the oak-facing window because warmth had been promised. The house learned the girl's breath that way. Names have climates. Rooms learn a person's rhythm. If you sleep where the house has room to hear your ordinary habits, you allow it to take you in increments. The way you turn, the way you cough at 2 a.m, the way you hum when you think you are asleep. I had let myself believe that my watchful night would be different because I was only a visitor. I set a thin blanket on the study couch because I told myself I would be ready to move at a sound. The couch remembers, I wrote in my mind as a test of my courage, and the study rememberers are the worst. At 2:30, a smell like wood smoke and old flour rose from the fireplace that had not been lit. I thought, absurdly, that a house would be polite enough to present a gift. I remember the kitchen fire in Daniel's story and how a rolled-up sleeve and a changed ledger followed it. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and slept as if sleeping in an archival box could be neutral. I woke with a scrap of dark under my nail and a new mark in the ledger that night. Nothing explicit, no name hashed in, but a vertical stroke like a bookkeeping tick beside an old entry.
The house had checked me as if I were inventory. I packed and moved, and I learned that sleeping where the house remembers you is an invitation for the ledger to learn the coordinates of your body. Rule 8. Never sign anything that belongs to the house. This sounds like a tautology until you hold another person's handwriting and see how easily it makes you small. Daniel included copies of forms, small slips that looked like maintenance requests, letters folded into homeowners' envelopes. A signature on those things was never a witness to generosity, it was a transmission. The first bargains began as signatures, a hurried scrawl over the mangled receipt of a doctor's bill, a Montgomery across a ledger in exchange for a child's fever abating. The house learned to read cursive as consent. That night I handled a stub of paper that was warm with somebody else's fingers. The check I had pocketed smelled faintly of iron and old tobacco. I considered for a ridiculous moment signing my own name on the back of it as proof, to tether my fine to me, to be the one who discovered the ledger. The tape recorder clicked. On the recording, Daniel's voice, thin, dry, said something that was not admonition so much as the exhausted clarity of a man finally seeing the math. Signatures are entries. He told of an aunt who, in grief, had written a name beside a sum and made the house a promise it kept. I folded the check in half and pushed it into my pocket deeper. There is a particular silence that comes with refusing a handout. It is the noise of a ledger closed for lack of ink. Rule 9. Do not relocate the dead or their marks. The house keeps what it is given, and it recognizes the difference between what is natural to it and what is trespassed upon. If you bury something to hide it, you only feed the roots with a new offering. Daniel's scrawled archives included a letter written by someone who had attempted to relocate a child's grave, perhaps out of remorse, perhaps out of pragmatism, and who then found that the tree produced a fruit swollen with somebody else's sorrow. Moving the body, moving the mark on a wall, taking a portrait off its nail, these actions are not neutral, they are signals. Upstairs, in a drawer beneath the linens, I found a foot-warmed wedge of cloth and small bones wrapped in a scrap of hospital linen, remnants of a burial that had been hidden under soil. The ledger made no footnotes for the bones, that was not necessary. The ledger is not always literal, it reads patterns and weights. I left the cloth untouched and slid it back into the drawer. For a long time I sat on the landing and listened to the house take in breath, thinking about how gardeners know the difference between pruning and severing. The house is a kind of gardener with a ledger instead of a shears.
Do not hand it new things to turn into roots. Rule 10. Do not respond to the house's questions. This is one of Daniel's clearest instructions, tucked in as if an afterthought. The house asks in small ways. A knock on the attic when there is no wind, a child's voice in an unoccupied room, a chair scraping on boards when all the family portraits look placid. To respond is to show interest. The house wants witnesses. Daniel admitted to trying conversation once, an attempt at negotiation in a tone he later called foolish. He had told himself that the house, like a human debtor, could be reasoned with. The house answered in ledger terms. It closed accounts. I learned this with a subtle and frightening lesson. After the click of the hollow step and the balance paper slipping into my glove, I heard a sound like a small cough behind the parlor door. It was a child's sound that might have been a laugh, might have been the settling of the stair, but it pitched with the same cadence as the recordings Daniel kept. "Are you awake?" it seemed to say, or perhaps that was how my mind framed it. The investigator part of me said, if this is an auditory phenomenon, document it. The human part, the one that used to be kinder to strangers, wanted to answer. I swallowed and did not reply. The sound persisted, patient, as if waiting for me to confirm that a human was there. I turned the recorder on in my lap and said nothing. The tape captured the childlike sound, and then nothing else. My silence was a refusal, and that refusal kept me from being named. Rule 11. Trust small guardians, but do not rely on them for absolution. The bishop stories are the softest thing in the ledger. Daniel wrote whole pages about the dog, as if pet records and miracle logs were the same thing. Bishop appeared at births and at funerals. He had a habit of lying in doorways, where his body deflected the house's hunger just enough to privatize a child's breath. Daniel said Bishop saved a child by interposing dog heat between the house and a family name. That saving was not free and not complete. Bishop could protect in the short term. He could not rewrite the ledger. There was a portrait in the hall with Bishop's eyes painted like 2 dull coins. When I placed my palm on the frame, the glass had warmed like a living hand. I felt shame at that small comfort, as if I had taken a moral loan in exchange for peace. Later in the study, one of Daniel's pages mentioned how the family had refused to bury Bishop in the plot with the humans, and instead had left him by the oak, so that the roots might remember him. That gesture read to me like a payment. I do not know if guardians pay or are paid. I do know this: to treat them with reverence may grant you a reprieve, but do not imagine that reverence buys you immunity. Rule 12. When the house asks for proof, do not provide it. This rule is the one that kept me alive in the first hours, when proof seemed the only currency I had.
The house is a bureaucrat with its own evidence requirements. The ledger wants a signature. The hollow step wants a person to stand. The tree wants a hair. The cellar wants a foot. Those items are often disguised as evidence, proof of lineage, proof of love, proof that you are the kind who can be saved. Daniel told, hushed and economic, of a time when a family member offered a scrap of a baby's blanket in exchange for mercy, an offer that later unspooled into a substitution of persons. He used a term later in the tape, the accounting of proof. The house records proof, then spends it. At nearly 3 in the morning, the house presented me with proof of a different sort. I found, carefully placed on the kitchen table beneath a coverlet, an open cabinet door with jars inside, jars of bran, a saucer with the desiccated fruit, a cup with a spoon that had been used recently enough to bear teeth marks. It was staged like evidence for me to hold and name. I had in my pocket the check and the strip that read balance. My heart wanted a photographic proof of what I had seen, an image for the internet, an item to brandish that would make my story credible. The tape in my hand recorded everything. I put the jars back where they were and closed the cabinet softly. That was, in its way, a small refusal. I did not become a witness who fed the ledger with public proof. The house knows how to turn proof into purchase. After the jars, I realized that the Knights of the Montgomerys had been a series of negotiated proofs. Each family member tried to demonstrate they were worthy, and the house cashed the demonstration. Daniel wrote, plainly, that proof was a currency the house would exchange only for permanence. He begged his future readers not to add their tokens to the counting. The scraping began again near the cellar at a pitched sequence that had finally become coherent to me as a threat. It was not exactly louder, it was simply more insistent. The house had decided to see if my small, erratic human dignity would hold up to an assault. I tell stories in which threats are always dramatic. A door slammed, a gust of wind like a hand. In this house, the assault was domestic and patient. It was chairs moved in empty rooms, a chair that would later have the shape of a body it did not yet contain. I tiptoed down the hall toward the kitchen not because I intended to confront it, but because stillness felt like bait. On the recorder, Daniel's voice came again, an old, exhausted man saying something very brief. If it scratches, do not show it blood. It was not a rule about literal wound, but a metaphor he used about attention. The house scratches at a door and wants you to bleed in response, emotionally, ritually, in some way that offers up your name.
He said once that the house liked to watch people pity each other in precise ways. I thought of the portrait with the penciled name in the corner and of my finger hovering over the abrasion I had thought to erase.
The house had scraped because it had heard my intention to alter the record. This was the near capture. It was not a single terrifying moment followed by a runaway chase scene. It was a geometry of pressure. A small scrape, a cough in the nursery, a low breath at the base of the stairs. I nearly answered the scrape. For a second, I can remember the exact sound of the floor under my foot. The idea of going down to prove myself honest took hold. I pictured myself pulling back a ledger and exposing the brittle spine. I pictured leaving my name on the page so no one could later claim I had not been there. I took 3 steps, and my entire life in that tenuous house hung on a choice. I obeyed Rule 1. I did not go down into the cellar. I obeyed Rule 10. I said nothing. I obeyed Rule 4 and refused to write my name where the house could read it. These small acts of refusal were not the heroic gestures of a protagonist in the usual sense. They were petty and cowardly and prudent. They counted. The scrape ended when I stopped moving toward it. A weight lifted off the stair like a sigh. The attic door ceased its deliberate creak. In the parlor, the recorder's red LED blinked like a heart monitor. Daniel's voice on the tape, older now, as if each playback made him more of a ghost, said, "It remembers how the brave move." He did not say it as praise, but as observation. The house learns models. I waited out the night as someone waiting for a storm to pass a city. Dawn came not like a promise, but like an intrusion, light that fell across floors and revealed dust like a ledger's residue. The house receded into another kind of watchfulness, the one that a building has when the sun warms its bones. I left as the pale gray widened into something usable again. I locked the gate behind me, although the lock had not been secure for years, and walked the lane with coat collar up and the weight of the ledger and the doll and the check in my bag. I had taken evidence. I did not take everything. I had also left proof on purpose, a recorder running in the parlor, the ledger where I had found it. There is no ethics here beyond the small one I invented for myself. Take enough to tell the story, not so much that you turn it into temptation. The house had, in one patient night, taught me a line of arithmetic I did not want to understand. When I returned home, I left the items where they would not be misread. The check went into an envelope and was photographed, catalogued, and then placed in a bank lockbox with other materials I had collected. The doll I left wrapped and sent to a conservator who agreed to keep it from being exhibited as a curiosity. The recorder, God forgive me, sat on my kitchen table and replayed Daniel's urgent, diminishing voice for the next several days, as if I could extract clearer rules from static. I transcribed every page and every spool onto a hard drive and into paper.
I put copies where historians might find them, and kept one in my pocket like a card for dark rooms. I have not published everything that was in that house, partly out of ethics, partly out of fear. Some knowledge, Daniel wrote, is designed to swell the hunger it names. I refuse to feed it. There are consequences to being the kind of person who walks into abandoned houses and leaves with artifacts. People will assume motives. The internet will turn the story into folklore in a single afternoon. Friends will say I romanticize danger and that I flirted with it for clicks. I am writing these rules because that is the only way I can take responsibility for the fact that in my curiosity, I placed myself where the ledger might have penciled me in. The rules are not formulas for survival in some literal sense. They are rather a moral armor, habits of refusal, little rites of self-denial that make a building less interested in you. I went back once after that night, only to make sure I had not left anything that would be used as bait. I did so in daylight and with other people present, an archivist, a lawyer, someone who knew how to handle papers without turning them into offerings. We stayed in the yard and did not cross the threshold. We held a distance because to cross it was to perform a transaction the house might be waiting for. That evening I received an email from the lawyer with pictures of a nearby stump of oak where the roots made a small cleared circle. The archaeologist sent a report taking care not to romanticize. It is tempting to imagine these as checks of civilization, orders that the house could be contained by paper and law. It is not so clean. This is Daniel's final confession, as much as it was mine. He had tried to end the lineage. He had believed at some length that by cutting the supply, by making a horrible calculation, he could starve the house. He failed. Or perhaps he succeeded in small local ways. The ledger continued, and he had scars to show for it. He left the rules because he could not trust that cruelty or even mercy would be done rightly by those who followed him. He wanted future readers to refuse the bargains he had once rationalized. I keep now one small physical piece from the house, a thin strip of paper creased and written with the faint pencil word, balance. That slip was not valuable in a monetary sense. It was valuable as a kind of omen. It sits in a drawer with the tape transcriptions and a photograph of Bishop's portrait,
which a conservator made for me because the original is still at the Montgomery place. I do not look at these things because they are souvenirs. I look at them because they are reminders of what I have promised. Not to accept miracles for the sake of comfort, not to let a ledger name me without my consent, not to pass on a hunger I can refuse. There are places in this city where people will tell the story of the Montgomery mansion as if it were a ghost store.
They will point at the gate and tell of cold winds and of lights. They will sell t-shirts. That kind of commercialization is different from what Daniel and I feared. The house learns from both. It learns that people take the thrilling edge of hunger by turning it into narrative. When you tell a story, you make it live again. Be careful which parts you hand back to the ledger. A final, private rule. One I add only because a man in a house taught me its geometry with the almost clinical tone of someone listing options. Don't make the ledger your only antagonist. In other words, do not spend your life trying to avoid every place that has ever had a name or a bargain. There are kinder things than avoidance. There is also a duty to warn. Daniel's rules are warnings. That is why I write them, and why you, if you ever find yourself near a boarded house that calls itself abandoned, should take them as a set of practices in dignity rather than as a ritual to be mimicked in full. I left the Montgomery place at dawn and did not look back. People have asked if I felt guilty, that I stole pieces of a family's history and then rendered it into cautionary listicles. I felt a different sort of guilt, the small one reserved for the living who survive when instruments used to keep them safe were misapplied. Daniel's papers did not absolve him. They only gave him a voice in future rooms. I used that voice to press the idea that bargains should be refused. If you go looking for proof, if curiosity pins your steps to the threshold of a house that breathes like this, remember the rules. Never go into the cellar alone. Do not take the fruit. Don't stand on the hollow step. Never let the house see your name written by you. Respect the guardians you cannot explain. Refuse to bargain. Do not sleep where the house can remember you. Never sign anything that belongs to the house. Do not relocate the dead or their marks. Do not respond to the house's questions. Trust guardians cautiously. And when the house asks for proof, do not provide it. Say no in small, stubborn ways. Starve the thing that is asking you to be its currency. One last thing. I left an envelope and a copy of the transcripts with a local historian who had the patience not to sensationalize, and I asked that the documents be handled with context. They can be found if you look in the right places, and I appreciate that some of you will want to hear Daniel's voice in full. If you want the recordings and the scanned papers, check the pinned link under this video. Take them with the caution they require. Do not rush to the Montgomery place because curiosity has its own ledger. Do not become an entry in someone else's accounting. I am telling you this as a warning from a night I am still not ready to forget. The house taught me rules by the softest of violences: omission, ledger ticks, quiet hunger. I obeyed them when I had to, and I almost did not.
That is why I write, to hand forward practices of refusal that may, in the small way of habits, keep you unrecorded. If you found this useful, or if it felt like more than just a story, share it with someone who ties their curiosity to their bones. If you want the deep dive, Daniel's transcriptions, photos of the artifacts, and a careful archival read, watch the follow-up I made where I go over each document in daylight and with experts who do not romanticize what is kept in ledgers. For now, remember, bargains asked lightly are often ledger entries in disguise. Refuse them. Leave the house to its math. Do not look back.